Welcome back in. Let's go ahead and stand. We're going to sing Be Thou My Vision together as we prepare for the next session. So let's stand and sing. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night. Waking or sleeping, thy presence my life. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance now and always. Thou only first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joy, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. You may be seated. Dr. Truman, would you come again?
Thanks very much. Well, in the first lecture, I tried to outline, sort of highlight some of the ideas that grip the contemporary imagination, and also point to some of the figures who, I think, provided a profound philosophical articulation of those ideas. I think Rousseau, Freud. If I'd had time, I would have touched upon Nietzsche and Marx. I think all of these men offer brilliant philosophical expressions of those things that shape what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary, shape our intuitions. But of course, it's very much the case that few people have read these men, unless you happen to have done a course on them in college or in high school. It is very unlikely that you will have read anything that they say. So how is it that our world, even I think our Christian world, is inflected by their thinking, that our imaginations to some extent are gripped by the ideas that they so often profoundly and in a literarily brilliant fashion articulate? Well, to get at that, I think we need to cast our net more broadly in terms of what we consider. And really, this is important because one of the things that I want you to take away today is this, that the answer to our current predicament is not an argument. Arguments are certainly part of that. We want to be able to give a reason for the things we believe. But an argument is not going to solve the problem. There is no silver bullet argument out there that is just going to change things. The reason for that is, well, it was made clear to me in the run-up to the Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015, when I would have students and people at church asking me, can you provide me with a good argument against gay marriage? To which my response would be, I can provide you with half a dozen good arguments against gay marriage, but none of them will work. None of them will work because the people you're talking to about this have not been persuaded to hold the position they do on gay marriage by arguments. Their intuitions have been shaped by other things. I write regularly for the online journal First Things. And in 2015, the editor, Rusty Reno, asked a number of us who are regular writers to do a piece on the Obergefell ruling. And they wanted to post this piece on the day that the ruling, the judgment was issued, the opinion was issued. And the way you do that, of course, is it's a little bit like, why do obituaries suddenly appear very quickly? Some years ago, I had to write an obituary of J.I. Packer, who's a big hero of mine. I remember commenting when I was asked to write it, but he's not actually dead yet. At which the answer goes, yeah, but we want to put it up as soon as he is dead, so can you write it now and we can get it out there as soon as he dies? I didn't really want to, thankfully I only crossed paths with Dr. Packer, who's a huge hero of mine some years earlier. It would have been embarrassing, I always felt, to have met him after I'd written his obituary while he was still alive. I never had that awkwardness. But the way you do it when you're waiting for something like a Supreme Court decision to come down is you write 2 articles. In 2015, okay, if Justice Anthony Kennedy votes this way, the judgment's going to be this, and this will be the article. If he votes that way, then this article applies. So we were each asked to write 2 pieces, only one of which would be published on the day, depending on which way the ruling went. And I sent my texts in, and the editor got back to me at the time, said, I've got your pieces, but I notice that there is only 1 sentence different between the 2. The one describing which way the ruling's gone. And I said, yes. And the reason for that is that I think the ruling will be significant in terms of some legal things, how it plays out legally within the culture, but the culture's already made its decision on this question. And the Supreme Court judgment, it's not that it's insignificant, but I'm looking at the culture, and it will not be very significant for the culture. It will not be very significant. Why is this? Well, as I say, it comes down to the cultural imagination, the social imaginary, and to understand something of how the social imaginary is formed. I want to start by making a distinction relative to what it means to be human. And the distinction is this. I think human beings, of all creatures on the face of the planet, there is a distinction, a fundamental distinction, between what human beings are and who human beings are. What do I mean by that? Well, think of an animal. I grew up in rural countryside in the West Country of England. My parents, for a while, kept ducks. The ducks were massacred by a fox. If you've seen one fox in the presence of one duck, you've seen every fox in the presence of every duck. Foxes, they're beautiful creatures, but they're killing machines. They're instinctive killing machines. You put a fox in the presence of its prey, there is only one outcome. The fox is going to strike to kill. I live now in beautiful western Pennsylvania. We have a family of foxes at the bottom of our garden that occasionally pop out. We maybe see them 2 or 3 times a year, perhaps. Haven't seen them for a while. More common for me is as I'm driving along to work, we have birds of prey. We have a bald eagle in the area. We have magnificent buzzards and falcons. And every now and then when I'm driving along, I'll see one and I'll see it drop like a stone. It's seen a rat or a vole or something in the field, and it strikes to kill. That's what falcons do. They kill their prey. Beavers build dams. Human beings build bridges. They build houses. There is a free intentionality to being a human being that characterizes our condition that does not characterize the condition of other animals. Such that if I engage in conversation with you between sessions, and I ask who you are, you don't give me your genome or your blood group or your chromosomes. You'll probably tell me about who you are relative to the things you've freely and intentionally chosen to do. You may tell me about your career, about whom you married, about the children you have, why you're here today. The things that are most important about you are not the instinctive things. Yeah, if somebody stands up and throws something at me now, I'm instinctively going to block the path of the object with my hand. We are creatures of instinct to some extent. But our instincts are not the most important thing about us. The most important things about us are our freedom. I would say our ability to act with intention relative to the future. And that means that we are able to imagine ourselves as being different to that which we are. We make choices that change us. And that's where things play into the social imaginary that allow us to change what we think it means to be a human being over time. I've quoted this in numerous lectures recently, but I want to quote you a passage from Goethe's great poetic drama, Faustus. You know the legend of Faust. Faust is he's the sort of the medieval alchemist who sells his soul to the devil, to Mephistopheles, in order for worldly delights and worldly power. And there are numerous literary versions of this story. Christopher Marlowe, the great English contemporary of Shakespeare, has a marvelous version of the Faust legend. But probably the most famous, and certainly philosophically the most sophisticated, is that which the great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote in the early 19th century. And here's a quotation from the first time that Mephistopheles meets Dr. Faust in his study. And listen to the temptation that Mephistopheles presents to Faust. "My dear sir," Mephistopheles says, "you are looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it. You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it?" And then we come to the last two sentences that are the ones I want to sort of zero in on. "If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs." Notice what Mephistopheles is doing there to Faust. In some ways, he's reiterating the Promethean temptation. Technology, he's saying to Faust, do not allow yourself to be limited. Technology will allow you to transcend yourself. Think about yourself in that way. Imagine yourself, Faust, to be somebody who can transcend themselves through the use of technology. And I want to suggest today that one of the big ways that our thinking about what it means to be a human, that has paved the way for this sort of anthropological crisis, where we no longer know what it means to be a human, one of the big ways this has occurred is through technology. We make a big mistake if we think that what technology does is allow us to do the same stuff faster. It doesn't. Technology mediates the world to us in a way that makes us and our relationship to the world fundamentally different. I'm an immigrant. Immigration for me is not the same as it was for the Pilgrim Fathers. Why not? Well, one of the reasons is technology. My wife and I are already booked. Plagues permitting, we are booked to fly home to see my mum late August this year. It will take me less time to get to my mother's than it took me to get to my hotel in Houston from Pittsburgh yesterday, if everything runs okay. Space has become a function of technology. 7 hours on a plane to London from Pittsburgh. 7.5 hours. That's all it is. That's all it is. It took me 12 hours to get to Houston yesterday. Technology has completely transformed what it means to be an immigrant. I haven't been able to call my mum for a couple of weeks. I've fallen out. I used to call her every week, then it dropped to every 2 weeks. During COVID, There's a limit to the number of 45-minute conversations about vaccines and masks that I can cope with. But I'm back typically now to phoning her every Sunday. Haven't been able to phone her the last couple of weeks because her phone was broken. But I'm able to hear my mum's voice with remarkable regularity. Unfortunately, she's discovered texting, so she's actually able to contact me anytime now. I say to the students, the real bad news is your mum always thinks of you as 13 years old. And in the presence of your mum, the really bad news is you think of yourself as 13 years old as well. Doesn't matter how old you are. But if I'd emigrated in the 17th century with the Pilgrim Fathers, I'd have said goodbye to my family on the wharf at Bristol, knowing that I was likely never to see them again, never hear their voice again. Emigration in the 17th century is not emigration in the 21st century. It's very, very different. Technology doesn't just give us the same things faster. It transforms who we are and who we think we are in the world around us. It also transforms how we think about the world. It tilts us more and more towards thinking about the physical world, and I'd include our own bodies in this, and you can see where I'm going with this later, as raw material. Technology inclines us to think that we have mastery and power, and that the world is just so much Play-Doh over which we can exert our power, should we so wish. And I would say, going back to the distinction I've made, what technology does, it is allows for a more dramatic separation of the who we are from what we are than ever before. We live in an unprecedented time in human history, where we can actually imagine that we are completely sovereign over who we are. Completely sovereign. In a way that in the past, the limitations of the what, the limitations of human nature, have played a significant role. Increasingly, we are able at least to imagine that that is not the case. How do we come to think this? Well, we could rephrase it. How do we come to think that we are autonomous, free individuals? How does technology do that? Well, I want to use a number of examples today. And the first one may surprise you, but I think it's actually of profound significance. I'm writing a book on nihilism at the moment, and I'm going to have a chapter on this, I think, in it. I was speaking at a college in California a couple of months ago, and I called them. I spoke to the guy 2 days before I went, and I said, I'm not going to get protested, am I? And he said, oh, no. I arrived at the airport, and I get into his car, and he said, let me bring you up to speed on something. There's going to be a protest. And it's kind of funny that I have to say, they're very polite protesters. The LGBTQ people all turned up for my lecture, and they all sat very quietly and politely, and they asked intelligent questions at the end, and then they left, and they went to protest me elsewhere on campus. And it was quite funny because I don't do Twitter, which means I'm a little bit more difficult to protest than some people. Because people who do Twitter generally provide 130, 140 characters of very offensive stuff that can be easily quoted. Apparently, I didn't go to the protest about me. I generally don't attend protests where I'm the one being protested. But apparently, they were having to read whole paragraphs of my writing. And I thought that was... I was kind of pleased about that. I said, if you're going to protest me, you've actually got to read a whole paragraph. You've got to put some effort into doing this. Well, when I started this lecture, I said, well, okay, I know some of you are here to protest me. I do appreciate you turning up and sitting politely and quietly, and I appreciate that. And please ask questions afterwards, I said. But what I want to do, I want to start by looking at the most controversial thing first, and then we'll move on to the less controversial. Let's get the gorilla in the room out of the way. Let's look at the aspect of technology that has led to our current cultural malaise. Music. Think about it. Music. That completely wrong-footed them, actually. They're expecting me to have a trans surgery or something. We'll come to that. Music. Think about music. Music has typically had a communal significance. I'm not aware of any culture. I'm not knowledgeable of all cultures in the world, but of all the cultures I'm aware of, all of them have a place for music. The music may sound different in sub-Saharan Africa to China or Korea or Western Europe or North America or South America. Music sounds different in different cultures, but all cultures seem to have music. Why? Well, I think by and large, music arose, I suspect, to fulfill communal needs. We're not brains on sticks. We have feelings. And music is often associated with communal events. One might celebrate a birth with a song or a party. Music is characteristic often of weddings. Key moment in the life of a community when a man and a woman get married. Music will mark that event. Lamentations. Look at the Psalms. Many of the Psalms are Psalms of lamentation, particularly those arising out of the context of exile. The people of Israel express their deepest feelings about exile in a psalm. And when you think about it, it makes sense because prose can get you so far in expressing emotion. Poetry maybe get you a little bit further still. But the combination of poetry and music is uniquely powerful. I think Wagner, the great 19th century composer, understood this in the way he put his operas together. There is a scene at the end of Valkyrie, Act 3, where Wotan, king of the gods, is his daughter Brunhilde has betrayed him, and he needs to punish her. And he's going to punish her by kissing her and taking away her divinity. And she's going to fall into a deep sleep on a bed that is going to be surrounded by fire until a great hero, Siegfried, will arise, who will be able to wake her up. And you think about it, Wotan he's king of the gods. He's been betrayed, so he's furious. He's been betrayed by his daughter, so he's brokenhearted. He knows what he's got to do, but he loves her. How do you communicate anger, love, and brokenheartedness in a unified way? You do it through a brilliant combination of poetry and music. And the music, I think at the end of Valkyrie Act 3, it's almost unbearable to listen to because, I'm English, which means I'm emotionally two-dimensional. But Act 3 of the Valkyrie, for a split second there, I'm emotionally three-dimensional. That music is very, very powerful. Very powerful. Music is used to express the deepest and most important things about what it means to be a human being. And say to the students, I have to teach this course, this capstone course, and the first 2 or 3 lectures have to be on epistemology, and at the end of it I say, well, thank goodness that's over, because nobody gets out of bed for epistemology in the morning, unless you're a professional epistemologist, which is one up from chartered accountant. CPA, I would say, is an interesting profession. No offense to any CPAs. My own dad was a chartered accountant, so I'm sort of hitting my own at this point. People get out of bed because of the things they love. It's the things we feel. That's which makes human life rich. It's what we love, what we hate, what we are, use the language, passionate about. And so music is a big part of that. Think of the African American spiritual tradition. Where does that arise from? A corporate experience of slavery. How do you as a people articulate the agony of being far from home and enslaved? You do it through music and poetry. We lament at funerals, don't we? We have parties, joyous, fun parties. My wife and I, we love to open our house for hospitality for the students I teach, but a word always gets out to students I don't teach who start to turn up. Recently, we've got students all out. We had about 50 of them, I think, at our house. And the phone goes, and it's alumni. A bunch of alumni happen to be in town and say, hey, we hear you've got an open house tonight. Can we come and join? So they turn up at my house, and I'm trying to learn to play the banjo. And one of them spots my banjo on the wall, takes the banjo down, starts playing it, and all the students start singing. It's Western Pennsylvania, sort of Appalachia, I guess. It's a happy occasion. Music marks that occasion. Music is a communal thing. It arose out of, reflected, and was a constitutive part of communal life. It was also, by definition, a live thing. It was a live thing. It had to be communal because it was live. It was a matter of communal production. Think about music for most of us today. I love music. Love live music. One of the great joys of teaching in a liberal arts college is we have a very vibrant music department. My wife and I get to hear student recitals and orchestra and jazz performances regularly on campus. I try to get to a live music performance, a band or something if I can every year or so. I was with Todd Pruitt, my friend, who's a Houston native. We went to hear Rush, the great Canadian. I'm not a big North America rock guy, but Rush I make an exception for. We went to hear Rush on their farewell tour, and I remember the two of us surveying the audience and seeing it was made up of 80% bald middle-aged guys, and thinking to ourselves, we're among our people. These are our people. But it's great. A live band. I can listen to Rush on my on Spotify or whatever, and I like Rush, but nothing beats being there at the live performance. Now think about how most of us experience music today. We experience it individually. Sitting on the plane yesterday, I like to read books on planes. I was sitting next to Katrina, so it's fine, but sometimes I'm flying on my own. I'm always glad when I sit down and the person next to me puts earbuds in, because I think, great, I haven't got to talk to them, I can just get on and read my book. But looking around the plane, it's amazing how many people have earbuds in. They're not reading books, they're listening to music. And that's how most of us consume music most of the time. It's an individual experience. It's a matter now primarily of individual consumption rather than communal production. Now you might say, well, what's he getting at here? Well, if music existed originally to bind the community together, what does it do when it pivots in its purpose to being not that which brings us together, but that which separates us and isolates us? I would say it shapes our imagination. It shapes how we think about ourselves as individuals. Free, autonomous individuals. Really autonomous now. I mean, I grew up in the era of vinyl. You know, you got a Pink Floyd album, you pretty much had to listen to the whole album in order. There was such a thing as the concept album when I was growing up. You don't have those. I probably have to explain that. Anybody under the age of 30 probably needs that concept explained to them. The idea was it was an album that conveyed a unified kind of message by listening to each track in order. I suppose Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band might be the original concept album. These days, we choose the music we listen to, when we listen to it, in isolation. I would suggest that that has a profound effect on how we imagine what it means to be a human being. Music once reminded us that we only were who we were in connection to others, an independency upon others. Music now tells us that we are free, autonomous, and independent. That, I think, is very significant. I mentioned dancing earlier. Think about dancing too. I try to make this point to this, when I teach the humanities course at Grove. I flick up early in the course, I put up on the screen 2 pictures. One of them is a scene from the 1990s British production of Pride and Prejudice, Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely, and it's the dance scene. It's the Miss Bennets and Mr. Darcy and other guys dancing. And the other picture I put up is John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever. Again, that's a kind of, to me, that movie was like yesterday. Now it's ancient. I was telling a group the other week, I was on a flight. I love going on long flights across the Atlantic because they always have the classic movie channel. Well, for me, for a movie to be classic, one of 2 things has to apply. It has to be black and white, or it has to involve Fred Astaire or Gene Kelly at some point. If it doesn't reach one of those criteria, it's not a classic. I'm sorry. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man franchise is now on the Classic Movie Channel. I remember taking my own kids to see Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man during my time in the States. That's not a classic movie. Very, very recent notion of what it means to be a classic. But go back to Saturday Night Fever. Let's, for the sake of argument, say it's a classic. What's interesting about those two scenes is this. Say to the students, if we could use computer software to take out all of the other dancers other than Mr. Darcy, he would look completely ridiculous. He would look completely ridiculous. Because dancing in the early 19th century was a communal activity where the individual only made sense to the extent that he connected to the others on the dance floor. Switch to John Travolta. John Travolta is simply strutting his stuff. Saturday Night Fever, dancing is essentially a solo activity. It's like a duel, Saturday Night Fever, but without guns, and instead with dance moves. The best dancer's going to win the girl. That's the kind of idea. Well, think about that. Again, dancing, that which once upon a time represented, resembled, and reinforced the notion that human beings exist communally and in dependence upon one another. When I'm dancing in that group with Mr. Darcy and the Miss Bennets, I depend upon the others to know the dance moves, and I have to coordinate myself to them in order for the dance to make any kind of sense, has been replaced by dancing as what? Autonomous self-expression. It's not the rules that allow me to be real. It's my inner self finding expression through my individual dancing that makes me real. Dancing, too, reinforces this ideal of the human being as autonomous and independent. Other ways technology has shaped how we think about what it means to be a human being as those who can transcend ourselves and have power over who we are. Think about the medical field. Think about medicine. Now, I would need to nuance this with more detail than I have time to do today, but think about how medicine has shifted its purpose. Medicine, I would say, broadly speaking, has shifted its purpose from being primarily restorative to being transformative. Good example, perhaps the best example of this would be plastic surgery. We have examples of plastic surgery from the ancient world. Ancient Rome, I believe, had forms of rhinoplasty. Goodness knows how agonizing it must have been to go through the procedure at that point. But modern plastic surgery is really galvanized after the First World War in Britain. Because after the First World War, you have a generation of young men returning from the war whose bodies have been horrifically mutilated by what's gone on in the trenches, what went on the Western Front. And plastic surgery really starts to pick up speed there because the idea is that the surgeon should strive to restore some dignity to the person before him. That's really the origin of modern plastic surgery. It's restorative. It's based upon a vision of what the human body should be and an effort to restore this person's body to that vision. We might put it in slightly more pompous terms and say it's rooted in an anthropology of normative human nature and embodiment and a desire to restore that in some way. That is not plastic surgery today. Think about plastic surgery today. I would suggest plastic surgery today, well, we call it cosmetic surgery, don't we? Katrina is in agonies today because I realized this morning that actually losing your luggage when you travel, it's much less hassle for a man than a woman. Sounds horribly sexist, but it just appears to be in my experience. You know, okay, I've lost my razor and my toothbrush and toothpaste. Other than that, I'm good to go. Katrina is not wearing cosmetics today. Cosmetics are that which allow us, if you like, to present as something that physically we aren't. Cosmetic surgery is what? It's often about transforming natural human bodies rather than restoring them. Now, there are people who suffer badly from burns, etc., etc. We still have that restorative angle, but I'm guessing that the vast majority of money spent on cosmetic surgery in the United States is not restorative. I'm guessing that most of it is transformative. We see it in other areas of medical ethics, gene editing. What is gene editing doing? It's delivering into our hands the possibility of designer babies. Now, don't get me wrong, I have a friend whose granddaughter has a genetic condition, and we were talking about this, and he said, if there was a way that we could have discovered that my granddaughter had this condition, and there was just a simple procedure that could have edited the gene in a way that she wouldn't have that condition, he said, I wouldn't have hesitated to have taken it. And I would say there's nothing wrong with that, because that's restorative. We have an understanding of what a normative human genetic makeup is. We know that people with Downs, as lovely as they often are, and the son of one of my very good friends has Down syndrome and is a beautiful human being. But we know that Downs is not how it should be. It's not how it should be. It doesn't make the person with Downs less human, any more than the person born with one leg is less human. But we know that really human beings should be born with two legs, not one. We have a normative understanding. But we know that gene editing is not heading in that direction. Gene editing is going to head in the direction of designer babies. It's going to head in the direction of transforming. Now fold that back into my fundamental question about what does it mean to be a human being? I've said the big myth today is that to be a human being is to be free and autonomous. Technology is allowing us to think that, even in terms of our own gene. The what we are, our genetic makeup, if you like, can now be dramatically subjected to who we desire to be. The realities of nature subjugated to the ambitions of desire. Think about the philosophy of sex and how that shapes how we think of it, what it means to be a human being. Talked earlier on about Freud makes the move to seeing sex as identity. That's common currency now, I think, for two reasons, at least two reasons, but one of them is this. That's certainly the message that is preached from many, many of the products of pop culture today, whether we're talking about the songs that are sung or whether we're talking about the movies and the sitcoms that are made. That person who is not sexually active is clearly inadequate in some way. That is the message that is pressed. I'm shocked at the sexually explicit nature of many lyrics today in pop songs. It's amazing to think that it was 1967 when the Rolling Stones almost couldn't appear on the Ed Sullivan Show because their new song was Let's Spend the Night Together. And they had to change the lyrics at the last minute to Let's Spend Some Time Together. You can find the clip on YouTube. It's quite funny because every time Mick Jagger sings the chorus, he rolls his eyes like this. Well, even in 1967, you could have spun the lyrics to say, well, it's a man talking to his wife. That's pretty mild compared to anything marketed even to 12 and 13-year-old girls. A couple of years ago, there was an awful attempt at a terrorist attack at an Ariana Grande concert in the UK. And tangentially, when I arrived at Grove, my first year, I was asked to compare the faculty talent show. I use the word talent in the loosest possible way there relative to my colleagues. I say to the students, if I'm not an academic, my career plan B involves the phrase, do you want fries with that? There's basically one thing I do, and that's it. And I thought it would be funny. I was supposed to compare this thing. And it's very hard when somebody tells you, do this and be funny. That's really hard. Humor is more spontaneous, I think. But I thought, what would be amusing is this. I'd seen Christopher Walken do it. And I thought, I'll do a play on something I'd seen Christopher Walken do. I would raise the question of, the American Revolution, good thing or bad thing. Well, let's compare poetry before the Revolution to poetry after the Revolution. I read Webster's Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes as the poem before the Revolution. And then for the poem after the Revolution, I thought it would be kind of funny to read some pop song. Because the thing about pop songs is when you read them, they just sound awful. They need the music to feel cool. And I knew the name Ariana Grande because I knew there'd been this attempted terrorist attack on her concert. And one of the most horrific things about this was that so many of the people in the audience were 11 and 12-year-old girls. So in my naive mind, I'm thinking, so these must be pretty safe lyrics. I'll find something there that's funny to read. I could find nothing that she'd sung that I felt in a good conscience I could read out for a laugh at the faculty talent show. I was not prepared to read the lyrics out loud for a joke. They were filthy. Marketed to 11 and 12-year-old girls, it made me think, what are the parents playing it? One response, of course, is, well, nobody listens to the lyrics, to which the next question is, so why do all the lyrics treat the same subject in the same way? If nobody's listening to the lyrics, you should be able to produce a song about self-control and continence and market it just as successfully. But you can't, because people do listen to the lyrics. It does matter what you listen to. Sex as identity has been pushed through pop culture. You don't need to read Freud's Civilization Its Discontents to get that point. Sex has become recreation, again, drawing on the point I made about music. Music always had communal significance. Historically, sex has always had communal significance because sex typically led to babies, and babies have social significance for families and communities. That sign, my wife and I saw it at a pro-abortion protest last year, the sign that you see sometimes waved about that says, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. That's a way of imagining sex that is only possible in a technological society. 200 years ago, consent to sex was at least consent to the possibility of pregnancy for one of the people involved. Technology has allowed us to think about sex as recreation. It's made it possible for the Freudian philosophy of sex to grip the popular imagination. It's made it possible to conceptualize sex as all about me rather than something that is all about somebody else with profound social and communal significance. And of course, in modern society, the advent of internet pornography has merely supercharged this. All of the evidence suggests that internet pornography is profoundly shaping, particularly how young men think about the significance of sex and sexual activity. You can talk about it. There are the standard things that one would object to morally, the objectification of somebody else, the connection to sex trafficking. I would also put it in sharper terms. I would say, what is pornography? Well, Roger Scruton, the great English conservative philosopher, talking about modern art, says modern art is a desecration of the human form. Modern art is taking that which is sacred and making it not sacred, is desecrating it. I would say pornography preaches a message of desecration of the human form in an extreme way. The other person is desecrated because what does Scripture teach us? Scripture teaches us that the other person is a person and not a thing. When Adam sees Eve, he says, "This now is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone." I think, Adam can look at all of the other animals on the face of the planet and probably think of them as things. But when he looks at Eve, he's not looking at a thing. He's looking at himself in a strange way, reflected back at him. Different but same. If you look at Milton's Paradise, don't go to Milton's Paradise Lost for your Trinitarian theology. It's very bad on the Trinity. But the section where Adam, I read it to the students, the section where Adam wakes up and Eve is standing before him, is very powerful. And I actually said to the girls in my class, I said, you need to ask your boyfriends and your fiancés if that's how they feel when they look at you. Because if it isn't, kick them to the curb. You deserve somebody better. She's a person. Pornography desecrates what it means to be a human being. It trains us to think of other people as things, not as persons. We might say it trains us to think of them as instrumental rather than as ends in themselves. And we all know that true love is about ends. It's not about instruments. We read those tragic stories sometimes in the news where a young couple are getting married and one of them is dying of some horrible disease, say cancer. And even by the time the news report hits the headlines that evening, the news report will end with, and within 3 hours the bride had died or the groom had died. And nobody watching that report thinks, what a stupid thing to do. What a waste of the last 3 hours of her life. We don't, because we know that love is exhibited most powerfully when the other person is an end in themselves and not an instrument to something we can get out of them. We know, for example, perhaps love in marriage is demonstrated most perfectly not on the wedding day, but at that moment when the one partner in the throes of dementia and Alzheimer's is cared for lovingly by the other partner, even though the one they love has sort of vanished into a fog. That's a powerful symbol of love, and it makes sense to us because we see something there of what it truly means to be a human being. Pornography tilts us against that. Pornography trains us to think of other people as objects. My wife and I had a very disturbing conversation about a year, maybe 18 months ago. I was speaking at a church and we had lunch with the pastor and his wife. And I asked his wife what she did for a living. And she said that she was a pelvic physiotherapist. And I said to her, what does a pelvic physiotherapist do? And she said, I deal with young women who've been physically traumatized by the sexual practices of young men who've got their sex education from watching pornography. And I actually said to her, what's the most difficult thing? What is the most common question you face or challenge you face? She said, it's persuading young women that sexual relations don't have to be excruciatingly painful. That's interesting, because to me that is, so young men are treating these young women as things, not as persons, not as selves. And that's a result of their use of pornography. Again, go back to what I said earlier. This view of human beings as autonomous tilts us towards seeing other people as we judge them. Do they make me more happy or less happy? Well, what's another way of phrasing that? We think of them as things, instrumental to our own fulfillment, not as ends in themselves. We might add as well that pornography isolates sexual acts from any kind of relational narrative. Young guy in the 19th century wants to sleep with a girl. What's he got to do? He's got to be clean. He's got to have a job. He's got to treat her with decency, because otherwise her dad, her mum, and her brothers aren't going to allow him to marry her. Sex is very costly in the 19th century. Technology has made sex very cheap. And in making sex very cheap, it has allowed for a desecration of the human form, and it has encouraged a generation, particularly of young men, to think of other people not as selves, but as things. That autonomous individual lies at the heart of it. And that brings me to transhumanism. And this is the thing I miss in the book, actually. When I look back at the big book, I think, well, there's a lot of stuff there that I would, I pretty much stand by everything I said still, but there are some gaping holes now as I look at it. One of the sort of gaping holes is the technology component. And one of the things that I missed completely is the LGBTQ stuff. I said in my first lecture, let's bracket out the T and the Q for a moment. I make this point in the book that the T is an unhappy partner with the L, the G, and the B, because sexual desire determines the L, the G, and the B. It's a bit different with the T. It's not necessarily a sexual desire thing. We have these weird situations where you have men who want to transition to being women, but they're still sexually attracted to their wives. It's sort of weird for us to think about, but it's the poker tell that tells us this isn't really about sexual desire. The alliance is really one of political convenience. So if we're not going to put the T under the bracket of the sexual politics thing, where might we locate it? Transhumanism. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is a term that is used for a variety of sort of philosophies and thinking. But they all share this one thing in common. They see technology as being able to deliver us from our bodily limitations. Some transhumanists are engaged in a quest for immortality. In its most radical form, can we download our brains into a computer and just keep the computer going for all eternity? Or until the sun gets so big it swallows us? I don't think eternity is going to go on physically forever, even on the humanist account. In other ways, it's a transcending of other bodily limitations. And transgenderism fits into that. Think about it. What technology has done, how is that doctor today able to respond, it's a problem with your body, not your mind? There's a philosophical story there, but there's also a technological story. The doctor in 1900 could not have imagined giving any other answer than it's a problem of your mind. We need to bring it into line with your body. Now technology has allowed us to imagine that actually the mind's right and the body's wrong. And we can gerrymander the body to bring it into conformity with the mind. The advent of transition surgery and hormones technologically enables us. And it transforms that social imaginary so that even for the man or woman in the street who's never read any gender theory in their life, it seems to make a kind of sense. Well, if somebody has the right hormones pumped into them and their body altered surgically in certain ways, well, yeah, they can be a woman or a man. Makes a kind of sense in a world where technology, as I said at the start of this lecture, has tilted us to think of nature as raw material over which we can impose our will. Quote here from a recent book. I actually published a review about it yesterday on the website, Thera Disputations. It's actually a reactionary feminist website. It's not often that I get to write for reactionary feminist things, but reactionary feminism is actually pretty decent feminism for reasons that you will see as I read this. It's from Mary Harrington, this new book, Feminism Against Progress, which I recommend to you all. It begins, she was a radical feminist, and then she has a daughter. And interestingly enough, she said, I started to change my thinking about feminism when I couldn't stop thinking about my newly born daughter as part of my body. That's an interesting inversion of the usual feminist argument. Because the daughter is merely part of my body, I can get rid of her any way I want. But Mary says, even after birth, I couldn't stop thinking of her as part of my body, that I had responsibilities towards. That's the twist. Here's how she talks about technology leading to a downplaying of the body. When we socialize in disembodied ways online, even as biotech promises total mastery of the bodies we're trying to leave behind, these efforts to abolish sex dimorphism, the physical difference between men and women, in the name of the human, will end up abolishing what makes us human, men and women, leaving something profoundly post-human in its place. In this vision, our bodies cease to be interdependent, sexed, and sentient, and are instead reassembled as a kind of, and I told Mary in correspondence, I wish I'd thought of this phrase, are instead reassembled as a kind of meat Lego, built of parts that can be reassembled at will. What Mary Harrington is saying there is all kinds of things press in. that stop us thinking about ourselves as bodies, that make us think of our bodies as lumps of meat that can be chopped up and reassembled at will. The fact that most of our communication now takes place in disembodied ways, by text. The fact that we now use the word friend to refer to people we may never actually have physically met in this world, and therefore may not actually exist, given the number of avatars out there on the web, tilts us away from thinking our bodies are important. Read the amicus brief in the Dobbs case. Last year, the Dobbs case led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Read the amicus brief by the professional female athletes of the United States of America. I'm not capable of parsing the legalese for you. Mr. Ken Wynn, who isn't here this morning, but Mr. Ken Wynn would be able to parse the legalese for you brilliantly. What I can do is tell you this. When I read that amicus brief, I was intrigued by the way the women referred to their bodies. Their bodies are not them. Their bodies are tools that allow them to be the athletes they are. They talked about their bodies as I might talk about a pen, or as a carpenter might talk about a saw and a piece of wood. It is weird the way they talk about their bodies, and yet it is entirely expected in the world in which we live, because we have disembodied ourselves in the way we think about what it means to be a human being. So as I close, circling back, the psychological nature of the way we think of ourselves is really a disembodied way of thinking of ourselves. We are our feelings, not our bodies. We are our thoughts, not our bodies. How did we get there? Well, most of us did not get there by being convinced that 20th century psychology was correct. Most of us got there because the world in which we live, the technological world in which we live, has shaped our imaginations in such a way that the body is no longer essential to who we are. And everything that's pressing in on us today in the church, whether we're talking about sexual mores, transgenderism, the importance of gathering together for worship on a Sunday, all of these things are shaped by that profound shift in the way we think about what it means to be a human being. There are no easy answers to this, but I hope in the third lecture to offer you at least some lines of reflection that will allow you to think in more constructive ways about what has gone on. The key thing is, we cannot solve the problem by merely thinking about the symptoms in isolation. We have to think about what lies at the heart or underneath those symptoms. And this is that radically autonomous, disembodied nature of what we think it means to be human today. Thank you for listening so patiently.
All right. So we still have one more lecture looking at the after lunch. I'm soon to give you instructions for lunch, but before that, we'll go ahead and let you know. Okay, so there's going to be a change in the schedule. The schedule on the website says that the third lecture would be at 1 p.m. What we're actually going to do is we're going to move the start time of the third lecture up to 12:45. Okay, so that gives us 1 hour to eat lunch, and then that will create some more time for us to have the Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions, don't forget to text good questions in. The update on the directions for lunch: as you exit the doors of the sanctuary, turn to the right, and the food will be on the tables out there. You know, you can grab a box lunch. I think there's 4 different options. Grab a box lunch, and then you can either go to the chapel, which is right here, and there are tables and chairs set up inside there, or you can go to the barn, which is, if you follow this, so this hallway we call Main Street leads you to the barn, which is the maroon building that looks like a barn, or it leads you to the chapel, which is right over here. I was told that if you're younger or younger in heart, to go towards the barn. I guess it's a little bit further away, but that's that direction. Chapel's this direction, but the food is all to the right. And then I've been told that there are drinks, throughout I guess I don't know if they're hidden or what, but the drinks are throughout Main Street, and so look hard, you can find them. All right, and so we're going to get started back at 12:45, not 1 p.m., but 12:45. So you've got an hour. If you didn't register for lunch, that's okay. Just hang back. Make sure there's going to be enough for everybody who did register. But we ordered some extra, so I'm confident there'll be plenty. And so why don't I pray and bless the food, and then you guys will be dismissed to go and get some food. So, Father, we thank you for your many blessings. Lord, thank you for our time together today. Thank you for this food you provided for us. Lord, we pray you would bless it and you would use it for the nourishment of our bodies. And, Lord, we desire to love you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We desire to serve you faithfully. So, Lord, bless this meal, our time together.